January 8th, 871. A frozen hillside in Berkshire. 1,000 West Saxon warriors stood in shield wall formation, watching 2,000 Vikings advance up the slope. The English were outnumbered 2-1. Half their army hadn't arrived yet. Their king was still at morning prayers, refusing to come until he'd finished his devotions to God. And a 21-year-old prince named Alfred looked at the approaching enemy and made a decision that would change English history. He would attack, alone, without his brother, without half his army, against impossible odds. Because waiting meant dying, and Alfred had decided he'd rather die fighting. This is the story of Ashdown, Alfred the Great's first major victory. The shield wall battle that proved Vikings could be beaten. And the day when a prince became a warrior, 7 years before he'd become the king who saved England. Welcome to Britain's history. Today we're diving into the battle that made Alfred, the fight that showed a young prince what leadership meant, that taught him how Vikings could be defeated, and that gave Wessex hope when hope seemed impossible. Because Ashdown wasn't just about tactics or numbers. It was about courage in the face of overwhelming odds, about faith confronting pagan fury, and about one young man refusing to accept defeat. But before we get to that frozen hillside, before we watch Saxon axes meet Viking swords in the most brutal form of Dark Age combat, we need to understand what brought Alfred to this moment. Because without knowing how close Wessex came to extinction in 871, you can't appreciate why this one victory mattered so much, or what it cost to achieve it. And if you're enjoying this deep dive into history, make sure you're subscribed. We cover the battles that shaped Britain, the victories that built a nation, the heroes who refused to surrender, the moments that defined our history. Don't miss them. Let's go back to 865 when the nightmare began. That year, the Great Heathen Army landed in England, the largest Viking invasion force ever assembled, led by warriors whose names still echo through history: Ivar the Boneless, Halfdan Ragnarsson, Ubba. These weren't raiders looking for quick plunder. They'd come to conquer, to stay, to carve kingdoms from English flesh and bone. Within 5 years, they destroyed 3 of the 4 great Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Northumbria fell first. York, once a jewel of Christian learning, became a Viking stronghold. King Æthelred was captured and, according to legend, executed by the Blood Eagle. That horrific ritual where the victim's ribs are cut from the spine and pulled apart like wings. Whether true or Viking propaganda, the message was clear: resist and die screaming. East Anglia fell next. King Edmund refused to renounce Christianity, so the Vikings tied him to a tree and shot him full of arrows until he resembled a hedgehog. Then they beheaded him. He'd be venerated as a saint. His kingdom would be remembered as a Viking possession. Mercia, the great central kingdom, lasted longer, but by 870, the Vikings had driven King Berkshire into exile and installed a puppet ruler. 3 kingdoms destroyed, only Wessex remained, and Wessex was fighting for its life. This was the world young Alfred grew up in, a world where Viking conquest seemed inevitable, where Christian kingdoms fell like wheat before the scythe, where the future looked dark and pagan. Alfred was the youngest son of King Æthelred of Wessex, born in 849 in the royal estate at Wantage. He'd been sent to Rome as a child, blessed by the Pope, educated in Latin and Christian theology. He'd learned to read and write, unusual for a prince in that age, but prophetic given what he'd later achieve. But Alfred also learned to fight. By his late teens, he was commanding men in battle, riding alongside his older brother Æthelred, who became king in 865. And in 870, when the Great Heathen Army turned its attention to Wessex, Alfred learned what war truly meant. The Vikings came in winter, December 870. When no one expected them, they seized Reading, a strategic town where the Thames and Kennet rivers met, and fortified it as their base. From here they could raid throughout Wessex, striking and retreating to their fortress before the English could respond. It was brilliant strategy, and it was working. King Æthelred and Alfred responded immediately. They couldn't allow the Vikings to consolidate their position. Within days they'd gathered an army and marched to Reading. The English attacked the Viking fortifications with fury, born of desperation. But the Vikings were ready. They'd built strong earthwork defences. And when the English assault stalled, the Vikings counterattacked. The Battle of Reading was a disaster for Wessex. The English were driven back with heavy casualties. Ealdorman Æthelwulf of Berkshire, one of the kingdom's most experienced commanders, was killed. The West Saxon army retreated in disorder, pursued by Viking warriors drunk on victory. It seemed the pattern was repeating. Viking conquest, English collapse, another kingdom falling. But 4 days later, everything changed. The place was Ashdown, Old English for Ash Tree Hill, somewhere in the Berkshire Downs. The exact location is still debated by historians, but it was probably near the modern village of Ashbury, on the ancient ridgeway that runs along the chalk hills. This was high ground, open downland where armies could see each other from miles away, where there was nowhere to hide and nowhere to run. The Vikings had left Reading and were marching across country, probably raiding or moving to a new position. They weren't expecting a fight, but Æthelred and Alfred had regrouped their shattered army and were hunting for revenge. When scouts reported the Viking position, the West Saxon army force marched through the night to reach Ashdown before dawn. This is where the historical record becomes fascinatingly detailed. Asser, Alfred's biographer, who wrote less than 20 years after the battle, gives us a vivid account. He tells us the Vikings divided into two divisions, one under kings Bagsec and Halfdan. Yes, the Vikings had two kings leading this army, and another under 5 jarls, the Viking equivalent of earls. They took position on the hilltop in two shield walls separated by a distinctive thorn tree that marked the high ground. The West Saxons also divided into two divisions to match the Viking deployment. King Æthelred would lead his men against the two Viking kings. Prince Alfred would face the 5 jarls. It was a sound tactical plan. But there was a problem. Æthelred was still at morning prayers. Here's what you need to understand about Æthelred. He was deeply, genuinely pious, a king who believed that God's favour mattered more than military tactics. So when his army reached Ashdown at dawn and found the Vikings already deployed on the hilltop, Æthelred refused to move until he'd heard mass. The king knelt in his tent with his chaplains, praying, while his army formed up and the Vikings watched from the high ground. Alfred stood with his half of the army, watching the Vikings. They held the hilltop, the best defensive position. They outnumbered the West Saxons, and they were experienced killers who'd conquered 3 kingdoms. Every tactical consideration said to wait for Æthelred, to attack with the full army, to maximise their chances. But Alfred saw something else. The Vikings were deployed, yes, but they weren't fortified. They were in the open, on a hillside ready to fight. If the West Saxons waited, the Vikings might withdraw to better ground. Or reinforcements might arrive from Reading. Or the Vikings might attack first, charging downhill with momentum on their side. Every minute of delay gave the advantage to the enemy. Alfred made his choice. According to Asser, the young prince decided to attack like a wild boar. He didn't wait for his brother, he didn't wait for orders, he didn't wait for favourable conditions. He simply formed his men into the tightest shield wall they could manage and charged up that hill at the 5 Viking jarls. Put yourself in Alfred's position for a moment. You're 21 years old. Your kingdom is dying. You've just lost a battle 4 days ago. Your king, your own brother, is at prayers while the enemy waits on the hilltop. Every rational voice in your head is screaming to wait for reinforcements. But you charge anyway, leading from the front, knowing you might die in the next few minutes. What does that tell us about the kind of man Alfred was? Let me know in the comments. The West Saxon charge up that hill must have been terrifying to watch. Men running uphill in mail armour, holding heavy shields, carrying spears and axes, screaming their battle cry. They hit the Viking shield wall with the force of desperation, and then came the most brutal form of combat the Dark Ages knew, the shield wall melee. Shield wall fighting is hard to explain to modern people. It's not the romanticised sword fighting you see in movies. It's not graceful or heroic in the Hollywood sense. It's men packed shoulder to shoulder, shields locked together, pushing and shoving while stabbing with spears over the shield rims or hacking with axes at enemy shields and faces. It's exhausting, terrifying, and utterly merciless. Men in the front ranks can't retreat. Their own comrades are pressed behind them, so they fight until they drop from exhaustion, or die, or the enemy line breaks. Alfred's West Saxons pushed uphill into that nightmare. The Vikings had the high ground, which meant gravity was on their side. They could strike down at the English, while the English had to strike up. But Alfred had momentum and rage. His men had lost at Reading. They'd seen their ealdormen killed. They were fighting for their kingdom's survival, and they were led by a prince who decided that dying on a hill was better than waiting to die in a tent. The battle raged around that thorn tree for hours. Asa tells us the Vikings defended themselves bravely, and that the fighting centred on the high ground marked by the tree. Men shoved, stabbed, hacked. Shields splintered, mail was pierced, warriors fell. The wounded crawled away or were trampled, and still the two shield walls ground against each other, neither giving way. Then Æthelred arrived. The king had finally finished his prayers. He'd heard the sounds of battle, the clash of weapons, the screams of dying men, and had emerged from his tent to find his brother already engaged in desperate combat. Æthelred immediately formed his division and charged the two Viking kings. Now the Vikings faced pressure from two directions. Alfred's men pushing up one side of the hill, Æthelred's men attacking the other. The Viking shield walls began to buckle. Warriors in the front ranks died and couldn't be replaced fast enough. Gaps opened in the line. And once a shield wall breaks, it breaks catastrophically. Men who were protected by their locked shields suddenly become isolated targets. Panic spreads. The wall becomes a mob. The mob becomes a rout. One of the two Viking kings, Bagseg, was killed in the fighting. We don't know exactly how he died, but Asa records it matter-of-factly. King Bagseg was killed. With him fell 5 Viking jarls. The leadership of the Viking army was decapitated in those brutal hours around the thorn tree. And when the shield wall finally broke, the Vikings ran. The West Saxons pursued them off the hilltop and down into the valley, cutting down fleeing warriors, killing anyone who couldn't run fast enough. The Vikings fled back toward Reading, their fortress 16 miles away. The English pursued them the entire distance, killing Vikings for hours. Asa claims the battlefield and the road to Reading were covered with Viking corpses, scattered everywhere, far and wide. This was a total victory, the kind the West Saxons desperately needed. They'd proven Vikings could be beaten. They'd killed a king and 5 jarls. They'd shattered a Viking army that had seemed invincible. And they'd done it through sheer courage, attacking uphill against superior numbers because waiting meant dying. But here's the hard truth about war in the Dark Ages. One victory didn't end the conflict. It didn't even end that year's campaign. 2 weeks later, at a place called Basing, the Vikings defeated the West Saxons again. A month after that, at Meriton, another battle ended in English defeat. King Æthelred was wounded at Meriton and died from his wounds in April 871. At 22 years old, Alfred became King of Wessex. He inherited a kingdom that had won one great victory but was losing the war. He inherited an exhausted army, depleted resources, and an enemy that wouldn't stop coming. The year 871 saw 9 major battles between Wessex and the Vikings. Alfred fought in all of them. He won some, he lost some, but he survived, and he learned. Ashdown taught Alfred crucial lessons he'd use for the rest of his life. First, that Vikings could be beaten if you fought them on your terms, not theirs. Second, that leadership meant making hard decisions. Sometimes you couldn't wait for perfect conditions, or full armies, or royal permission. Sometimes you had to charge the hill, because waiting meant defeat. Third, that morale mattered as much as tactics. His men at Ashdown fought with desperation and fury, because they believed in their prince and their cause. These lessons would save England 7 years later. In 878, when Alfred would face his greatest crisis, when he'd hide in the Somerset marshes with his kingdom conquered and his army destroyed, he'd remember Ashdown. He'd remember that impossible odds could be overcome. He'd remember that courage could defeat numbers. And he'd lead his reformed army to victory at Edington, saving Wessex and laying the foundation for a united England. But in January 871, Alfred wasn't a king yet. He was a young prince who'd made a desperate gamble and won. He charged uphill into a Viking army because someone had to. He'd fought for hours in the shield wall because his men needed a leader who wouldn't abandon them. And he'd won England's first major victory over the Great Heathen Army because he'd decided that dying like a warrior was better than waiting like a coward. That thorn tree on Ashdown, the landmark that marks where the fiercest fighting occurred, is long gone. We don't even know its exact location, though amateur historians and archaeology enthusiasts still search the Berkshire Downs looking for the battlefield. The site might be near King Standing Hill, or Lowbury Hill, or a dozen other ancient hill forts along the Ridgeway. The landscape has changed in 1100 years. The tree is dust. The men who fought there are forgotten. But what they achieved isn't forgotten. Ashdown was the first time an English army had decisively beaten the Great Heathen Army in battle. It proved that Viking conquest wasn't inevitable, that English warriors could stand against the invaders and win. It gave Wessex hope when hope seemed impossible, and it transformed a young prince into a warrior leader who would, 7 years later, save England from extinction. Today, if you walk the Ridgeway on a winter morning when frost covers the chalk downland, you can almost imagine it. Two armies on the hill, shields locked, warriors screaming, blood on the frozen ground, the crash of weapons and the cries of dying men, and a young prince charging into the maelstrom because his kingdom needed him to be brave. Alfred would go on to become the only English monarch called the Great. He'd reorganise Wessex's defences, create a navy, reform the law, promote education, and commission the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle that preserved the history of his people. His descendants would unite England and establish a dynasty that ruled for generations. Scholars still study his military reforms, historians still debate his strategies. And after 1100 years, statues of Alfred stand in Winchester and Wantage, testaments to the king who saved England. But before all of that, before the reforms and the learning and the legend, there was a frozen hillside in Berkshire. There was a young prince who decided to charge the hill. There was a shield wall that held. There was a Viking king who died. And there was a victory that proved England could still be saved. Ashdown mattered because it showed that resistance was possible. In a world where Viking conquest seemed inevitable, where 3 kingdoms had already fallen, where the future looks pagan and dark, one battle on one hill proved that English warriors could still win. It didn't end the Viking threat. That would take another generation. But it ended the myth of Viking invincibility. And sometimes, in the darkest hours, that's enough. The Great Heathen Army would campaign in England for another 8 years after Ashdown. They'd win battles, conquer territory, and nearly destroy Wessex completely. But they never again faced the West Saxons without knowing that English warriors could stand in shield wall and fight them to the death. That knowledge, that fear, made a difference. And it started on a winter morning on Ashdown, when a prince too young to know better charged a hill he couldn't win and won anyway. Within a generation of Alfred's death, his son Edward the Elder and his daughter Æthelred would reconquer the Viking territories piece by piece. Within 2 generations, Alfred's grandson Æthelstan would unite England under one crown for the first time. The nation Alfred saved at places like Ashdown and Eddington became the England we know today. Its language, its institutions, its identity shaped by the king who refused to let his people become Viking slaves. If this is the kind of history that fascinates you, the turning points, the desperate victories, the moments when everything hung in the balance and one person's courage made the difference, then you know what to do. This channel exists because these stories deserve to be told. What other battles made England? The Viking Wars that followed, Alfred's great victory at Eddington, the Norman conquest that changed everything. Drop your suggestions below. Thank you for watching Britain's history, the stories that mattered, told the way they deserved.